A hospital's silence was broken, not by alarms or rushing doctors, but by the quiet persistence of a watcher no one could ignore. Each night the presence returned, waiting without food, without shelter, bound to something greater than survival. When the truth finally surfaced, the weight of it was almost unbearable. Don't miss what happens like, and subscribe if you believe in loyalty, and share in the comments what part of the world you're tuning in from. Nurse Marjorie Hensley had seen almost everything in her 15 years on night shifts. Cardiac arrests, frantic families, miracles and tragedies within the same hour. But she had never seen a figure like this. Outside the emergency entrance, in the teeth of a raging winter storm, sat a German shepherd motionless against the swirling snow. His coat was slick with sleet, his ribs outlined beneath wet fur, yet his body never trembled. His eyes, luminous amber, were fixed with unyielding devotion on the third-floor hospital windows, as if the world outside those panes was all that mattered. Ambulances came and went, their sirens slicing the night, but the dog's vigil never wavered. When one roared in bringing stretchers with patients half-shielded against the storm, the shepherd lifted his head, ears pricked high, scanning the faces as if searching desperately for someone familiar. Each time, hope flared and died in a flicker of his gaze. When none matched, he lowered his head again, the weight of disappointment settling over his broad shoulders. Marjorie found herself drawn to the glass doors, her breath fogging the window as she studied him. Snow clung to his back like a heavy blanket, yet he bore it without protest, chest rising in slow, steady breaths that looked too weary for an animal his size. For a fleeting second, his eyes shifted to hers through the glass, and it was as if she had been seen, not merely glanced at. She felt the strange pull of recognition, though she had never laid eyes on him before. On her short break, she stepped outside into the biting cold, the wind clawing at her cheeks, and approached him cautiously. The shepherd turned his head, but didn't move. She crouched, her voice soft. "Hey boy, what are you doing out here?" Instead of barking, he tapped his paw against the ice 3 times, measured, deliberate, like a man tapping fingers on a desk while waiting. She frowned, unsettled by the intention behind it. He wasn't begging for food or attention. He was keeping time, waiting for something unseen. A couple exiting patients slowed, watching the scene. "That dog's been here every night this week," one whispered to the other. "He never leaves until morning." The words hit Marjorie harder than she expected. This wasn't a lost pet wandering aimlessly. This was an animal with a mission, a sentry bound by an invisible oath. She looked closer. His fur, though drenched, bore a faded sheen that spoke of once being brushed regularly. The leather collar was cracked, but intact, not the makeshift rope of a stray, and his stance, regal patient without fear, carried the air of discipline like a soldier at post. She extended her hand slowly, offering warmth. To her surprise, he didn't lick or shy away. Instead, he lowered his head and pressed his forehead gently against her knee, holding it there with a trembling stillness. The simple gesture pierced her heart more than any cry for help could have. It was trust, silent and fragile, given freely to her as though she were meant to understand. Snowflakes spiraled down, clinging to his ears. His amber eyes lifted once more to the third-floor windows, unwavering. Marjorie followed his gaze, but saw only curtained glass glowing faintly with fluorescent light. Yet the dog's conviction was undeniable. He knew who he was waiting for, and he would not move until that person came. Even as the storm intensified, blanketing the world in white, the shepherd remained a sentinel, steadfast in his vigil. Inside the hospital, the antiseptic smell of disinfectant and faintly burnt coffee should have anchored Marjorie back to her duties. But her mind lingered on the image outside, the soaked dog beneath the relentless snow eyes, full of a grief too human to dismiss. She carried the weight of it into every room she entered, every chart she filled. Each time she glanced through the lobby's windows, the sight of him still there struck her anew. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't restless. He was simply waiting, as if time itself was a debt he was willing to pay for love. And though Marjorie could not yet understand who or why, she knew with chilling clarity that his vigil meant more than mere instinct. Something sacred was at play, a story carved deeper than words. She whispered to herself as she closed another file, "That's not just a dog, that's devotion." It was only the first night she noticed him, but already she felt the quiet certainty this was the beginning of something far larger than she could imagine. He was not only waiting for someone, he was teaching her and everyone who passed what it meant to love beyond reason. The storm carried into the next night, and Marjorie Hensley found herself drawn again to the sight she could not erase from her mind. When she stepped outside during her shift break there, he was the same German Shepherd sitting in the same spot, his chest dusted with snowflakes, his eyes unwaveringly fixed on the third-floor windows. She remembered how he had pressed his head against her knee the night before, and the memory still left a strange ache in her chest. Tonight she brought with her a piece of bread and some leftover chicken from the cafeteria. Thinking that at least she could ease the hunger she assumed was gnawing at him, she knelt down, offering the food carefully, but he only sniffed it once before lowering his head again and gently placing a paw against the door as though trying to reach through the glass. The gesture was so deliberate that it stopped Marjorie's breath. He wasn't focused on her offering. He was focused on someone beyond that door, someone his soul was tethered to with a rope stronger than hunger. She tried to coax him, pushing the food closer, whispering soft encouragements, but his eyes only flickered toward the third floor, never wavering, and the food remained untouched on the ground between them. As an ambulance arrived with another patient, the shepherd stood suddenly, his tail lifted slightly, ears alert, eyes fixed on the stretcher being rolled inside. For a brief, heartbreaking moment, his face lit with hope, but when the covered patient turned out to be someone else, the light in his eyes dimmed, and he lowered himself to the ground, the despair evident in every slow movement. Marjorie stood frozen, realizing she was witnessing something raw and human in its intensity. His hope, his disappointment, his refusal to leave, all spoke of a story etched deep into loyalty. Inside, rumors had already started to ripple among the staff. Some nurses said the dog had been seen almost every evening for over a week. A janitor claimed he had caught sight of the shepherd long after midnight, still sitting at the door, his breath fogging the glass, his body curled against the bitter wind, but never moving from his chosen post. To the casual passerby, it looked like stubbornness. To those who lingered long enough to really see him, it looked like love carved into endurance. A young orderly, curious, walked past and muttered, "That thing's been out here night after night. Whose dog is it anyway?" No one answered, but Marjorie found herself studying the collar more closely. The cracked leather bore faint etchings, worn but legible, and inside she saw letters carved with careful hands. Rufus. She whispered the name aloud, and for the first time the shepherd turned his eyes to her, as if recognizing the sound of his true self. The moment was fleeting, but it felt like a door opening. He didn't approach or wag his tail. He simply looked at her, acknowledged her, and then turned his gaze back to the third floor where his heart still belonged. Later that night, when security made a round, they spotted the shepherd and shook their heads. One of them grumbled, "If he's still here tomorrow, I'm calling animal control. Can't have strays hanging around the entrance." But as they advanced, Rufus did something unexpected. He did not growl or bare his teeth. He lowered his belly against the icy ground, placed both paws outstretched, and pressed his nose flat against the threshold of the door, as if to say, "This is my place. You will not move me." The guards hesitated, unsettled by the dignity in his refusal. Finally, one muttered, "Leave him. He's not hurting anyone." They walked away, but Marjorie's heart pounded in relief. She felt as if she had just witnessed not resistance, but faith so profound that it silenced authority. The snow thickened as the hours passed. Marjorie finished her rounds, but she kept glancing toward the lobby windows where the shepherd remained a dark silhouette against the white storm. Midnight came and still he did not budge. She thought about his paw tapping the night before his refusal to eat the rhythm of his waiting, and she knew this was not accidental. There was intent behind his vigil, and it was tethered to someone in that building. Her eyes followed his gaze again to the third floor, and for the first time she wondered which patient had a bond so strong that even the brutal cold could not sever it. By dawn, when Marjorie returned to the lobby, Rufus was still there, his back dusted with snow, his breath heavy, but steady, his eyes raw with exhaustion, yet burning with devotion. A few early patients walking in stopped to stare. One woman clutched her chest and whispered, "He looks like he's waiting for his master to come home," another added softly, "or refusing to believe they're gone." Their words hung in the air, painful and true, because everyone who saw him knew instinctively that this was no ordinary animal. He was not a wanderer. He was a guardian bound to someone unseen, and in his silence, in his steadfast refusal to leave, he told a story more powerful than any words could hold. The following evening, Marjorie Hensley returned to her shift with Rufus still haunting her thoughts, and sure enough, when she walked past the emergency entrance at dusk, there he was again, sitting exactly where she had last seen him, his body worn but steady, his eyes never leaving the third-floor windows. The snow from the previous night had hardened into ice along the sidewalks, and yet he held his vigil as though the cold meant nothing, as though his very heartbeat was tied to what waited behind that glass. Marjorie had begun to wonder if she was imagining meaning in his actions, but the longer she watched him, the more certain she became that this was not chance. A dog does not ignore hunger, fatigue, and weather unless something greater anchors him. She whispered his name, Rufus remembering the faint etching she had discovered on his collar. At the sound, his ears twitched, and his head turned toward her for only a moment before lifting back to the third floor. That tiny acknowledgement pierced her more than 100 words could have. She needed to know who he was waiting for. Later that night, while she was at the nurse's station filing paperwork, she asked the staff if anyone knew the story behind the dog outside. A janitor leaning on his mop shook his head. "He's been coming for days, maybe longer. Shows up before dark leaves after dawn, never causes trouble. Just sits there like he's on duty." Another nurse, older and with decades of experience, lowered her voice as though sharing a secret. "I've seen that dog before. He belongs to a man on the 4th floor, room 407. Name's Eldon Carver, Vietnam vet. Cancer's got him in the late stages. That dog used to come with him for checkups before he was admitted. When Eldon couldn't walk anymore, I guess the dog started waiting." Her words carried the gravity of revelation. Suddenly, everything clicked into place for Marjorie. Rufus wasn't wandering here by accident. He was fulfilling a bond, one forged long before illness had taken Eldon inside these walls. Curiosity tugged at her, and when she had a chance, she made her way to the 4th floor. She walked down the corridor, her eyes skimming the room numbers until she found 407. The blinds were half drawn, and through the small gap, she saw the faint outline of a frail man in a bed. His skin pale, his frame shrunken. Machines hummed softly at his side tubes, connecting him to life he seemed barely clinging to. She stood there longer than she intended, not wishing to intrude, but feeling as though she had discovered the missing half of the puzzle. When she returned downstairs later, Rufus was still there, gazing at the very window that belonged to Eldon's room. The next night, Marjorie could not resist kneeling by Rufus again. She touched his collar with more care this time, and her fingers brushed against the inside of the worn leather. She realized there were more than just letters. Beneath Rufus, another inscription had been scratched nearly invisible with age, EC, and R, until the last watch. Her heart clenched. It wasn't just a collar, it was a vow, a declaration carved in leather, that this dog and this man were bound until the final moment. She whispered Eldon Carver, testing the name aloud, and Rufus let out the faintest sound, not quite a bark, not quite a whine, but enough to let her know he understood. It was the sound of recognition, of confirmation. The storm eased that night, but the cold did not, and still Rufus would not move. A couple entering the ER paused to watch him. The woman said softly, "He's waiting for his master. You can see it in his eyes." The man nodded. That kind of loyalty, it's not something you see every day. Their words carried weight, and Marjorie could tell others were beginning to notice too. Each person who saw him seemed changed in some small way, as if his silent vigil reached into their own hidden places of love and loss. During her shift, Marjorie found herself telling a young intern about Rufus. The intern looked doubtful at first, but then admitted he had seen Eldon smile faintly in his bed when someone mentioned the word dog. The intern said he whispered something about Rufus dragging him out of trouble once, something about Da Nang, Vietnam, like that dog saved his life back then. Marjorie's chest tightened as she imagined a younger Eldon in the chaos of war, a loyal shepherd at his side, and how that bond had carried through decades to this moment, to this hospital, to this icy vigil. That night as she ended her shift, Marjorie once again walked to the entrance where Rufus still sat. She knelt down, and this time she didn't try to feed him. She simply rested her hand against his fur, damp from melted snow. "I know now," she whispered. "I know who you're waiting for." He didn't turn to her, but he didn't need to. His stillness, his gaze, his quiet devotion spoke louder than any acknowledgement could. She realized that she was standing not before a stray dog, but before a soldier in his own right, keeping his last watch for his master, faithful until the end. And for the first time, she felt tears sting her eyes, not for herself, but for the love she was witnessing, a love she could not ignore. The days passed, and with each one, the story of the dog outside the hospital grew heavier inside Marjorie's mind, because Rufus never left his post and never surrendered to fatigue or hunger, and she began to feel that his devotion was not only to Eldon Carver, but also to something greater, something like a sacred duty. The staff had grown used to his presence now, and even the patients who came through the emergency doors began to slow their pace when they saw him whispering to each other about the dog who waited in the snow for a dying man upstairs. Yet not everyone was moved by tenderness, because on the fourth night, security finally decided that his constant presence was a problem. The head of security was a stern man named Gerald Briggs, who valued rules above sentiment, and when he saw Rufus lying outside the entrance as if carved into the concrete, he shook his head and muttered that it was time to remove him. He radioed for animal control, but before the order could be carried out, Marjorie hurried to intervene. She pleaded with Briggs to reconsider explaining that the dog belonged to Eldon Carver in 407, a veteran who was barely hanging on, and that Rufus was not a stray, but family. Briggs scowled and argued that regulations existed for a reason, that animals could not linger around patients or doors, but before the argument escalated, Rufus made his own reply. Instead of baring teeth or growling, Rufus lowered himself all the way down his belly, pressed flat to the icy ground, his nose against the threshold of the automatic doors, his paws stretched straight before him, as though he were saluting, as though he were saying this was his ground, and he would not trespass further, but neither would he leave. The silence of that posture was more powerful than any noise he could have made. People walking by stopped, struck by the sight, and even Gerald Briggs hesitated, because he could not deny the dignity radiating from the animal. He muttered something about giving it another day, and walked off, leaving Marjorie with tears in her eyes, because she knew she had just seen faith expressed in a language beyond words. She knelt beside Rufus and whispered, "You knew, didn't you? You knew that silence would be louder than fighting." He leaned against her for a moment, his eyes glimmering before turning back to the windows above. Inside, the whispers grew into full conversations. Staff swapped stories of Rufus, of the way he reacted every time a stretcher passed, of how he tapped his paw on the ground as if measuring time. Some said he was counting the hours left for Eldon Carver. Others said he was signaling that he was still here and would not leave. When Marjorie went upstairs again, she entered Eldon's room quietly and found him awake, his breath shallow, his eyes staring at the ceiling. She leaned over and told him softly, "He's still here, Eldon. Rufus is outside, waiting for you." For the first time since she had known of him, Eldon smiled faintly. His lips cracked into the ghost of a grin, and he rasped, "That dog never quits. He pulled me from fire once. Guess he's pulling me from the fire again." His hand trembled as he tried to lift it, and Marjorie helped him until it rested against the window pane, the same pane Rufus gazed at every night. When Marjorie left the room, she carried the weight of that frail smile with her. She returned downstairs, and through the glass, she saw Rufus raise his head slightly as though sensing the gesture from above. The connection between them was unbreakable, a tether stretching across glass, across illness, across the line between life and death. Later that night, a small group of patients and family members gathered at the window to look at Rufus. One little boy asked, "Why won't he come inside where it's warm?" His mother whispered, "Because he promised to stay right there." The boy pressed his hand to the glass as if to keep the dog company, and for a moment, Rufus glanced at him before returning to his vigil. The weather turned crueler as the hours passed, but Rufus did not move. Snow layered across his back, and the frost clung to his whiskers, but still he sat upright, breathing slowly, his eyes unwavering. Marjorie felt helpless, wishing she could explain to him that the rules of the world were different, that he didn't need to punish himself this way, but she also understood that he did not see it as punishment. He saw it as loyalty. When the sun finally crested the horizon, spilling pale light across the parking lot, Rufus was still there, unbowed. A couple of doctors entering for the day shift stopped to marvel at him. One of them whispered, "That's not just loyalty. That's devotion carved into flesh." That evening, Marjorie brought out a blanket and placed it beside Rufus, and though he did not lie on it, he touched it with his paw, as though acknowledging her kindness before settling back into the snow. She sat beside him for several minutes, the cold biting through her scrubs, and for the first time, she truly understood what it meant to keep vigil. It was not just waiting. It was standing guard over someone's life with every heartbeat you had left. She realized that Eldon and Rufus had lived like soldiers in different forms, bound by battles and rescues long past, and now they were bound again by this final fight. She whispered into the night, "You are a better friend than most humans ever managed to be." Rufus turned his head briefly, pressed his forehead against her arm, and then returned to watching the light above his silence, once again louder than words. The hospital had grown used to the silent figure outside its doors, and whispers about Rufus spread not only among the staff, but among visitors, patients, and even delivery drivers. Yet, Marjorie knew that something had to change, because loyalty like his could not be ignored forever. After the confrontation with security, after Eldon Carver's faint smile and whispered words about his dog, she felt a resolve forming inside her chest. She knew rules were rules, but she also knew compassion was meant to be the heart of their profession, and leaving Rufus outside in the cold night after night seemed to her like an act of cruelty against both the dog and the man upstairs who was fading away. On the fifth evening, Marjorie took her courage in both hands and approached the charge nurse to ask permission for something extraordinary. At first, the request was dismissed, but when she explained who Rufus was, what he meant to Eldon, and how Eldon's days were numbered, the hardened exterior of procedure began to crack. The charge nurse hesitated, then agreed quietly. "If you keep it discreet, if he doesn't disturb anyone, maybe just a few minutes. But don't let it be noticed by the wrong people." With that fragile approval, Marjorie walked straight to the entrance where Rufus sat under the steady snow. She opened the sliding doors and gestured for him to come in. For a moment he remained still, as though unsure if this was allowed. But then, as if recognizing that his long vigil had been granted permission, he stood and padded forward, each step, deliberate, strong, quiet, filled with restrained anticipation. The hospital staff who noticed stopped in their tracks because Rufus did not sniff or wander or act like an animal unleashed. He walked with direction and his head high, as if he already knew exactly where he needed to go. He reached the lobby and paused at the elevator, sitting squarely before the closed doors, staring up at the button for the 4th floor. Marjorie's mouth went dry, because this was not coincidence. She pressed the button, and when the doors opened, Rufus entered and turned to face forward, his tail curled neatly around his legs. Other staff who happened to be in the elevator with them fell silent, struck by the calm presence of the shepherd, who carried himself not like a pet, but like a soldier marching toward a final mission. When the doors opened on the 4th floor, Rufus walked out and down the hall without hesitation. He passed one room after another, ignoring sounds, smells, and distractions, until he stopped at the door of 407. There he sat, tail sweeping the ground, once then lowered himself flat against the floor paws, stretched out nose pressed to the crack beneath the door. It was as if he were announcing with his posture that he had completed the journey, that he had found his way back to his post, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Marjorie swallowed hard, feeling her chest ache, because it was no longer a story of a dog outside waiting. It was a story of reunion within reach, and she knew that behind that door, Eldon Carver lay waiting too. She gently opened the door, and at once Rufus rose, stepping forward carefully. Eldon's frail head turned weakly toward the sound. The old soldier's eyes widened, and though his voice was barely more than a rasp, he whispered the name with reverence, Rufus. The shepherd padded forward, climbing onto the side of the bed with care, avoiding the tubes and wires, and lowered his head onto Eldon's chest. The monitor beeping beside them quickened slightly, as if even the machines knew that life had been sparked by love. Eldon's thin hand trembled as it reached toward Rufus's ears, and the dog remained utterly still, his body quivering only with relief. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. The nurses present froze, their eyes shining with tears as they watched a man too weak to lift his head smile for the first time in days because his companion had found him again. Eldon whispered something else, fragments of words about Da Nang, about fire, about how Rufus had dragged him out once, and now Rufus had found him again, not on a battlefield, but on a hospital bed, still saving him in the only way he knew, by refusing to abandon him. The impact of that reunion spread through the staff like a tide. Some wiped their eyes, others pretended to busy themselves with charts, but none could escape the power of what they had seen. Rufus remained curled against Eldon as though no time had passed, as though decades of loyalty had collapsed into this moment of presence. Marjorie felt herself trembling too, because she had been the bridge, she had been the one to bring them together. And though she knew rules had been bent, she also knew no regulation could compete with what she had just witnessed. For the rest of the evening, Rufus stayed in room 407, never moving from Eldon's side, his breathing steady, his eyes half closed as though guarding his master through the night. Eventually, Marjorie coaxed him gently back to the hallway because she feared discovery, but Rufus did not resist. He followed her back to the elevator and down to the lobby where she opened the door and let him out again. He returned to his spot outside, curling himself on the frozen concrete as though nothing had happened, but she knew something had changed forever. He had found the path upstairs, and he had touched his master's chest one more time. His vigil had transformed into something new, not only waiting, but keeping watch from both sides of the glass. Marjorie whispered to herself as she returned to her rounds. That was no dog walking those halls. That was a soldier on duty. And in her heart, she knew that Rufus would never waver, that he would find his way to Eldon as many times as it took until the end. The air in room 407 felt different after Rufus was allowed to touch his master again, And though Marjorie had guided him back outside that night, the change in Eldon Carver's spirit was undeniable, because the next day, when she entered his room, she noticed his frail lips curled into a faint smile, and though his body was collapsing under the weight of illness, his eyes carried the glimmer of peace, as if the presence of his dog had pulled him back from the abyss just enough to remind him that he was not alone. The staff who had witnessed the reunion spoke of it in whispers down the hallways, and for the first time in weeks, Eldon responded to their questions sometimes, only with nods or brief murmurs. But there was life where before there had only been surrender. By the second evening, Marjorie could not bear to leave Rufus outside, so once again, under the quiet permission of sympathetic nurses, she let him back in. And again, Rufus went straight to the elevator, straight to the 4th floor, straight to the door of 407, moving with such certainty that no one dared stop him. Eldon heard the soft scrape of his nails before the door opened, and when he saw Rufus step inside, he whispered a sound that was half laugh and half sob. Rufus climbed carefully onto the bed, his movements deliberate, avoiding the tubes, and then lowered his head onto Eldon's chest where he belonged. The monitor beside the bed picked up a rhythm that had been weak and erratic, but now it steadied slightly, as though the heartbeat recognized the weight of loyalty resting upon it. Eldon lifted his trembling hand and stroked the side of Rufus's face, fingers brushing the fur with reverence, and he whispered, "You came through the fire once, boy. Now you came through the storm, always finding me." Tears welled in Marjorie's eyes as she stood back, watching two souls who had crossed decades together settle into the comfort of one another once more. Eldon's voice cracked with exhaustion, but he continued speaking in fragments, mentioning Da Nang, mentioning mortar fire, mentioning how Rufus had dragged him by the vest when he was bleeding, how he had sworn that as long as they both lived, he would never leave Rufus, and how the dog had answered that promise tenfold by never leaving him now. Rufus whined softly, pressing closer, the sound vibrating against Eldon's ribs like a note of devotion, too pure for words. Marjorie leaned closer and heard Eldon whisper her name. She bent down, and with breath rattling against his chest, he whispered, "Don't let him be alone. Promise me." His eyes were desperate, his hand clutching hers with a strength that surprised her. She nodded, tears blurring her vision, and he exhaled with relief as though passing a final command to a fellow soldier. Rufus seemed to understand, because he lifted his head just long enough to look at her with eyes that burned amber in the dim light, then lowered his head back down, committing himself to the weight of his master's chest. Hours passed with Rufus refusing to move. Nurses entered, checked IV lines, adjusted monitors, but no one disturbed the dog. They recognized the sacredness of the moment, for they had never seen a bond like this, and their hearts knew this was not a violation of hospital rules, but the fulfillment of something larger than rules could contain. Eldon drifted in and out of consciousness, his thin lips still brushing words when he woke, sometimes calling Rufus by name, sometimes muttering fragments of military commands, sometimes whispering prayers no one else could hear. Each time, Rufus responded with stillness, with presence, with the pressure of his head against Eldon's heart, as though he were anchoring him to the world by sheer will. Then came the moment when the monitor began to falter. The beeps grew slower, stretched farther apart, the line trembling toward its inevitable flat. Marjorie was at his side, instantly calling for the doctor, but before anyone could adjust medications or prepare interventions, Eldon opened his eyes wide one last time and focused entirely on Rufus. With a sudden clarity, his voice strong for the first time in days, he said, "Until the last watch," and pressed his lips to the dog's forehead. As the words left his mouth, the line on the monitor steadied for a single strong beat, then flattened into silence. The room was filled with the sound of machines wailing, but over it rose the long, low howl of Rufus. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was grief poured into sound, the kind of sound that froze every soul who heard it. Nurses in the hallway stopped family members waiting in chairs, bowed their heads, and even the doctor who stepped forward froze for a moment, recognizing that he was witnessing something that transcended medicine. Rufus did not move after the howl. He kept his head pressed to Eldon's chest, even though no breath rose beneath it anymore. His body shook with quiet sobs, though no tears fell, and his eyes stayed shut, as though by closing them, he could pretend the man was only asleep. The staff hesitated to touch him, because it seemed wrong to separate them, but finally the attending physician whispered, "Give him his time," and so the machines beeped their flat note. The staff stood in silence, and Rufus remained where he was completing the last reunion in a vigil that none who saw it would ever forget. When eventually the orderlies moved to prepare Eldon's body, Rufus resisted not with growls, but with his weight. He planted his paws against the blanket and pressed his body firmly as though shielding him one last time. Marjorie placed her hand on his back and whispered softly, "He's gone, Rufus, but he's not gone from you." The dog finally lifted his head, let out another low moan that seemed to shatter the air, and then allowed himself to be coaxed aside. As the orderlies wheeled Eldon away, Rufus followed his pace slow, his head lowered, his body trembling, but still refusing to let his master out of sight. For the rest of that night, Rufus lay curled outside room 407, nose pressed to the door that no longer held the man he loved. Staff brought blankets, some even brought food, but he ignored it all his vigil, transforming from one of waiting for life to one of mourning death. Marjorie sat beside him, her own tears falling freely, and she realized she had become not just a witness, but a keeper of a promise, the one Eldon had passed to her with his final strength. The hospital ward had been hushed since Eldon Carver drew his final breath, and in the days that followed, the echo of Rufus's howl lingered in the minds of everyone who had heard it, because it had not been the cry of a beast, but the lament of a soul losing its other half. Nurses spoke softly about the moment, about how the old soldier had pressed his lips to the dog's forehead and whispered, "Until the last watch," and about how Rufus had responded with such grief that even hardened staff members felt tears run down their cheeks. Yet while the man's journey had ended, Rufus's was far from over, because his devotion had been sealed not only in a collar, but in a command one that Eldon had entrusted to Marjorie in those final moments when he gripped her wrist and whispered with urgent breath that she must not let the dog be alone. Marjorie carried those words with a gravity she could not ignore. She had taken vows as a nurse to heal the sick and comfort the dying, but now she felt she had been drafted into something different, a promise to a soldier that extended beyond the grave. And every time she looked at Rufus, curled in the corner of the ward outside the empty room, she knew the vow was already binding her. Rufus had not eaten since Eldon's passing. Trays of food were set down near him, by sympathetic staff blankets were offered, and gentle words spoken, but he ignored them all. His nose pressed to the crack beneath the door of room 407, as though waiting for a scent that no longer lingered. His body grew thinner, his fur dulled, but his eyes still burned amber with a determination that terrified Marjorie, because it was the look of someone who refused to move until his mission was complete. On the second night after Eldon's death, Marjorie stayed late and sat beside him on the cold linoleum floor. She stroked his fur, whispering, "He's gone, Rufus, but you're not. You still have a purpose. You're not meant to fade here." Rufus leaned against her for a moment, trembling, and then released another of those long, low cries that rolled down the hallway like a haunting hymn. People passing by stopped in their tracks, their eyes wet, because the sound seemed to come from a place that was neither wholly canine nor wholly human, but somewhere sacred between. The next morning, the staff prepared to move Eldon's belongings from the room, and Rufus immediately rose and followed the gurney down the hall. He kept his head low, his tail dragging, but his eyes locked on the bag that contained the man's folded uniform and a few personal items. When they tried to carry it away, Rufus pressed against the orderly's legs, blocking him until Marjorie intervened and promised softly that she would guard the belongings for him. Only then did Rufus step aside, though not without another anguished moan. That day, Marjorie realized that Rufus was not simply grieving, he was waiting for orders, and the only one left to give them was her. She began asking around for more details about Eldon and Rufus, trying to piece together the fragments she had heard from Eldon himself and the intern who mentioned Da Nang. An older veteran named William Hart, who volunteered at the hospital, heard her questions and came forward with tears in his eyes. He told her that Eldon and Rufus had been inseparable since the war, that Rufus had been trained to detect mines and had saved lives more times than could be counted, and that when Eldon retired, he fought to keep Rufus with him instead of leaving him to the military kennels. They were brothers in arms, William said. That dog isn't just a pet. He's a soldier waiting for his last command. Those words lodged deep into Marjorie's chest because she understood then that the promise she had made to Eldon was not symbolic. It was literal. She had become the one responsible for issuing the final command that would give Rufus peace. That evening, she sat with Rufus again and whispered the same promise she had made to Eldon. "You're not alone. I'll take you with me." Rufus turned his eyes to hers, and for the first time since Eldon's death, he shifted his head from the door and rested it against her leg. It was not joy, not relief, but it was acknowledgement, as though he understood that she had stepped into the role his master had left behind. The air felt heavy with ceremony, and Marjorie realized she had just been accepted into a bond that had survived warfire and now death. Yet Rufus did not immediately follow her home. The next night, when she tried to lead him away from the hospital, he stopped at the entrance, planted his paws firmly, and refused to move. He looked back at the 4th floor, ears pricked, and gave a soft whine. Marjorie crouched beside him, whispering, "He's not there anymore, boy. He's gone." But Rufus tapped his paw 3 times on the ground, the same rhythm she had heard on that first night, and she realized he was counting, measuring, keeping vigil until some invisible clock struck the end. She stayed with him, weeping, because she understood that devotion like his could not be broken in a day. The hospital staff rallied around him, bringing food and water, and though he resisted eventually, he took a few bites when Marjorie hand-fed him. It was a sign that he was still willing to live, still willing to carry out the last order, but on his own terms. In the hallway upstairs, Eldon's uniform and jacket were placed in a box, and Marjorie arranged for them to be given to her so Rufus could have a piece of his master to anchor him. When she brought the jacket down and laid it beside him, Rufus immediately curled around it, burying his nose into the fabric, inhaling the scent with shuddering breaths. That night, he finally slept the first true rest since Eldon had passed. Word spread through the hospital and even beyond, and people began visiting just to see the dog who had refused to abandon his master. Some took photographs, others stood silently in respect, but all left changed by the sight of a German shepherd, curled around a faded military jacket, guarding it as though it contained the last heartbeat of his soldier. Marjorie realized that Rufus had become more than Eldon's companion now. He had become a living emblem of what love and loyalty truly meant. Still, the weight of Eldon's final command pressed on her. She knew she had promised to care for Rufus, to make sure he was not alone, and she knew the time was coming when she would have to lead him fully away from the hospital into a new life. But in that moment, watching him breathe steadily beside the jacket, she accepted that he needed to finish his vigil, his way, because soldiers do not abandon posts. They only leave when relieved of duty. And until Rufus understood that the watch was complete, no command would free him. The hospital never quite felt the same after Eldon Carver passed, because even though patients came and went, the staff carried on with their routines and the machines beeped the same mechanical notes. There was now an unshakable weight in the air, the echo of a soldier's farewell, and a dog's endless cry, Rufus remained outside, room 407, for days, refusing to eat more than what Marjorie herself coaxed into his mouth, refusing to sleep anywhere, except curled against Eldon's faded jacket, refusing to lift his gaze from the door that no longer opened. His body grew thinner, and yet no one dared call him weak, because what radiated from him was not weakness, but a devotion so fierce it frightened those who witnessed it. Families waiting in the hall whispered about him. Patients asked to see him, and staff members paused their rounds to stand quietly, acknowledging that what he was doing was not ordinary animal behavior, but something sacred, a vigil for the fallen. Marjorie stayed close every night, watching him with a mixture of heartbreak and awe, knowing that she had promised Eldon she would not let Rufus be alone. She began bringing a blanket to lay beneath him, though he never settled on it for long, always shifting back to the cold floor, as if the chill itself was part of his penance. When visitors asked about him, Marjorie explained in gentle words, and each time she did, their eyes filled with tears. The story of Rufus spread through the hospital until even people who had never met Eldon came to pay silent respects to the shepherd who kept watch. Children pressed their hands against the glass of the waiting area, whispering goodnight to him, and old veterans saluted when they passed him in the corridor, unable to walk by without honoring the bond they saw reflected in his amber eyes. On the third night after Eldon's death, Rufus made a sound that silenced the entire ward. It was not the long, anguished howl he had released the night Eldon died, but a low, steady hum, a mournful vibration deep in his chest, rising and falling with each breath. It echoed down the corridor, and people stopped walking to listen. Marjorie was by his side, instantly stroking his fur, whispering, "I know, boy, I know." She realized the sound was not grief alone, but ritual, as if Rufus was singing his master through the gates of memory, marking each night with a hymn of loyalty. When hospital staff finally prepared to clean out room 407, Rufus followed them, his steps slow, his tail dragging, his eyes fixed on the stretcher that carried away Eldon's belongings. When the door was locked, Rufus laid his head against it, releasing a groan that felt like it belonged to the earth itself. The head nurse hesitated, then ordered softly, "Leave him. He belongs there as much as any of us." And so Rufus remained outside that door, while inside, the machines were powered down, the sheets stripped, the bed prepared for the next patient. The respect Rufus commanded grew each day. Even the gruff security chief, Gerald Briggs, who had once wanted him removed, now lingered in the hall just to look at him. He admitted quietly to Marjorie, "That dog shames the rest of us. We give up too easy. He doesn't give up at all." Marjorie only nodded because she knew Briggs was right. She also knew Rufus was not simply mourning. He was obeying Eldon's last command, standing watch until he was relieved, and she carried the burden that she was the one meant to relieve him. But how do you tell a soldier his duty is complete? That question haunted her. Every time she stroked Rufus's fur, she felt the weight of Eldon's dying hand on her wrist, pressing the promise into her bones. She wondered if Rufus would ever leave willingly, if he could ever step away from his post. Then one evening, when the corridor was quiet and the lights dimmed, a veteran named Major Franklin Doss arrived to visit another patient. When he saw Rufus lying outside 407, he froze. His face crumpled, and he whispered, "I know that dog. I know him from Vietnam." Marjorie's eyes widened as the major told his story. He explained that Rufus had once detected a tripwire mine and saved an entire squadron, dragging Eldon and others out of danger while bullets rained down. "He's not just waiting," the major said, voice breaking. "He's standing the last watch for his brother." Then the major did something that made every nurse and visitor in the corridor stop. He stood at attention and his back straight, his chest out, and he raised his hand in a formal salute to Rufus. The shepherd lifted his head, his ears pricking his eyes, locking onto the soldier's gesture, and for a brief moment, his posture changed, his chest rising as though he recognized the honor. The nurses followed, one by one, bowing their heads. Families in the waiting room pressed their hands together. Even Gerald Briggs, the skeptical security chief, raised his hand in salute. The corridor was silent, but for the sound of breathing, a ceremony held not for a man in uniform, but for a dog whose heart had carried a uniform's weight his entire life. Rufus responded by placing his paw on Eldon's jacket, the fabric still resting on the floor beside him, and lowering his head again, his gesture a silent vow that he accepted the salute, but his watch was not yet complete. Marjorie wept openly, then kneeling beside him and whispering, "He was your commander, but you are ours now. You don't have to be alone." Rufus leaned into her hand, but his eyes remained on the door, as if to say he would not abandon it until he knew the duty was finished. She understood she would have to find the words, the moment to tell him the truth, that Eldon had given him his last command, and that command was to let go. But until then, Rufus would keep his vigil, and the hospital would keep its silence, honoring the dog who reminded them all what it meant to love, without conditions, to stand guard until the very end. By the time a week had passed since Eldon Carver's death, Rufus had become something more than a patient's dog to those who worked in the hospital, because his story had spread from one ward to another, from the lobby to the cafeteria, until it seemed everyone knew about the German Shepherd who refused to abandon his master's door. People came quietly in the evenings to glimpse him lying outside, room 407, his nose pressed against the crack, his body curled around the faded jacket that still smelled faintly of Eldon. They brought flowers and notes. They whispered prayers, and they saluted him as if he were carved from the same honor as the man he had loved. Even doctors who prided themselves on being detached paused in the hallway to watch him, and though none spoke, their eyes revealed what their training could not hide. They saw loyalty in its purest form, and they recognized it as something rare and holy. The recognition reached beyond the hospital walls. Local veterans heard the story and began arriving one by one. Some came with medals pinned to their jackets, some with canes, some in wheelchairs, but all stood in silence before Rufus. One evening, a frail Marine named Douglas Vaughn wheeled himself down the corridor, tears already wetting his cheeks before he even reached room 407. When he saw Rufus, he raised his trembling hand and saluted. Rufus lifted his head, ears pricked, eyes steady, and though he did not move, the acknowledgement was clear, a silent exchange between brothers in arms. The corridor filled with quiet sobs from those who watched, because they knew they were seeing more than a dog. They were seeing the embodiment of devotion that did not recognize the boundary between war and peace, between man and beast, between life and death. Marjorie stood with them, her heart swelling with both grief and pride. She remembered Eldon's rasping voice, his plea not to let Rufus be alone, and she felt the promise like a brand upon her. She knew she was now the keeper of this soldier's legacy, and every time she saw Rufus lift his head at the sound of a salute, she understood that she was standing beside a hero who had never been recognized with medals, but who carried the weight of valor in his very being. Veterans spoke of Da Nang, of tripwires and firefights, of how Rufus had saved men by detecting mines before they exploded, of how he had dragged Eldon through the mud with bullets whistling past. These were not tales told for glory, but for reverence, and as they recounted them, tears ran down weathered cheeks because they knew Rufus had never stopped serving. One night, Major Franklin Doss returned, this time with a group of young cadets from the local ROTC program. He wanted them to see what service meant, what loyalty demanded. He gathered them in the hallway and pointed to Rufus, who lay with his head resting on Eldon's jacket. This, the major said, his voice unsteady, is what it means to stand a post. This dog is teaching you what no textbook can. You may think courage is medals and parades, but courage is staying when everyone else has gone, keeping faith when the world tells you to leave. The cadets stood stiffly, some with tears shining in their young eyes, as Rufus slowly lifted his head and looked at them as if weighing their worth. One cadet raised his hand in a shaky salute, and Rufus let out a soft whine that sent chills through the group. They would never forget it. The hospital administration began to discuss what to do. Some argued that Rufus could not remain forever in the corridor, that he needed a home, that rules could not be suspended indefinitely. But others pushed back, saying that removing him would be an act of cruelty, that the hospital had become sacred ground because of him, that patients found comfort in knowing he was there. One woman undergoing chemotherapy told Marjorie, "When I see that dog, I remember my father's service. I remember that love is stronger than pain. He gives me courage to keep fighting." Another patient whispered, "If that dog can endure the cold for his master, then I can endure another night of this treatment." The stories multiplied until it was clear that Rufus's vigil was not only for Eldon, but for everyone who passed through the hospital. He had become a symbol, a living monument to endurance and love. Marjorie knew that eventually she would need to take Rufus home with her to honor the promise she had made, but she also knew she could not cut short this chapter because Rufus was not finished. He was still keeping the last watch, and to deny him, that would be to dishonor both him and Eldon. So she remained by his side, feeding him by hand when he would allow it, sitting with him in the silence when he would not. Sometimes she spoke to him about Eldon retelling the stories she had learned, and though Rufus never replied, his eyes seemed to soften as if he understood that she was weaving memory into words so he would not be forgotten. The turning point came when a group of veterans' families arranged a small ceremony in the hospital courtyard. They carried photographs of their loved ones, they brought flags, and they gathered to honor not only Eldon, but Rufus as well. Word spread quickly, and soon the courtyard was filled with patients, nurses, doctors, and strangers. Marjorie led Rufus outside, and though he was slow, his body tired from grief, he walked with dignity, his tail low but steady. When they reached the courtyard, a hush fell over the crowd. The flag was raised, taps were played on a single trumpet, and all eyes turned to Rufus. Without being prompted, he sat tall, ears erect, eyes locked on the flag, and then he lifted his head and released a single howl, long and mournful, carrying through the cold evening air like a hymn. People wept openly, clinging to one another, because they knew they had witnessed a moment that could never be repeated. From that day on, Rufus was spoken of not only as Eldon's dog, but as a hero in his own right. The local newspaper ran a story and veterans groups shared his tale, and strangers came to the hospital to see him. Yet through it all, Rufus remained unchanged. He returned each night to room 407, curling around the jacket, refusing to move until he was satisfied his watch was complete. Marjorie accepted that this was his way, that until he felt the burden lifted, she would not try to drag him away. She would simply remain beside him, honoring the soldier and the dog who had become one story, one memory, one legacy of love that could not be severed. Winter's grip began to ease as the weeks turned, but the presence of Rufus at the hospital remained the same. A constant silhouette at the door of room 407, his body thinner now, yet still upright, his head often resting on Eldon's jacket, his eyes never far from the window above. The staff who once viewed him as an oddity now saw him as a guardian of the building itself, a living reminder that love could outlast flesh and duty could extend beyond death. People came from towns away to see him, to kneel in silence beside him, to tell their children the story of the dog who would not leave his soldier, and many left offerings of food blankets or letters tucked beneath his paws. Yet Rufus accepted none of it except the food Marjorie hand-fed him, and even then only sparingly, as if to remind them all that he was not living for himself, but for the memory of Eldon Carver. The hospital administrators finally agreed to allow Marjorie to take Rufus home, knowing she carried Eldon's last command, and that she alone had the bond to relieve him of his vigil. Still she hesitated, because she understood that Rufus would not leave until he chose to, until he understood in his own way that his duty was fulfilled. Each night she sat with him, whispering to him about Eldon, reminding him that his master spirit was gone from this place, that his love lived on, that the promise he had kept was already honored. Rufus listened in silence, his ears flicking his amber eyes, watching her intently, and though he did not rise, she could sense he was beginning to shift, beginning to understand. The turning point came one evening when a group of school children visited the hospital with handmade cards for the veterans. They stopped by Rufus, each child touching his head gently, thanking him for being brave. One little girl knelt down, pressed her forehead against his, and whispered, "You don't have to wait anymore. He's proud of you." Marjorie saw something change in his posture then. Rufus sighed deeply, a sound like surrender, like release, and lowered his head onto the jacket, not with tension, but with peace. She knew in that instant that his long watch was nearing its end. The next morning, Marjorie brought him outside into the crisp spring air. For the first time since Eldon's death, Rufus did not stop at the hospital door to look back toward the fourth floor. Instead, he walked steadily beside her, tail low, but not dragging his body, leaning slightly against her leg, as if to say he was ready to follow her lead now. They reached her car, and though she expected resistance, Rufus climbed in slowly, curling onto the seat, resting his head on Eldon's jacket, which she had carried with them. Tears streamed down Marjorie's face as she whispered, "You've done enough, soldier. You can rest now." At her home, Rufus adjusted with surprising grace. He explored each room quietly, then returned to the jacket and circled it before lying down. Marjorie placed it in a spot near the hearth, and Rufus claimed it as his bed. In the evenings, she sat with him, speaking softly, telling him stories about Eldon that she had learned from fellow veterans about the man's bravery, his humor, his stubbornness. And Rufus would close his eyes, his ears twitching as if he were storing each word like a treasure. He ate more, his coat regained some of its shine, and though his eyes always carried the shadow of loss, there was now a gentleness to his movements, a quiet acceptance that spoke of healing. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and red, Marjorie took Rufus into her backyard where spring flowers were blooming. He lay down beside her, resting his head in her lap, and for the first time since Eldon's passing, she heard a sound from him that was not grief, but contentment. A soft sigh followed by a slow closing of his eyes. She stroked his ears and whispered, "He loved you more than words, Rufus, and now it's my honor to love you too." The dog gave one final deep breath, a breath that seemed to carry years of loyalty, battlefields, vigils, and sorrow, and then he drifted into a sleep so deep and peaceful that Marjorie could not bring herself to move. She watched him, her tears falling freely, and she realized that this was the completion of Eldon's last command. Rufus had kept his watch until the very end, and now, knowing he was not alone, he had allowed himself to rest. In the days that followed, Marjorie buried Rufus in her garden beneath a tree that bloomed with white flowers, wrapping him in Eldon's jacket, as though returning him to his master's embrace. Veterans from the town came to the small ceremony, saluting the mound of earth, some weeping openly, others standing in silence, but all knowing they had witnessed the story of a hero. The hospital staff sent flowers, patients sent letters, and children painted pictures of a German shepherd sitting tall beside a soldier, both watching over each other. Marjorie placed a plaque on the tree that read, "Until the last watch, Eldon and Rufus," ensuring that their bond would not fade into memory, but remain as a lesson for anyone who came near. The story of Rufus spread far beyond the hospital and the town. Newspapers carried it, veterans groups shared it, and strangers who had never met Eldon or Marjorie spoke of it as proof that love transcends the limits of flesh and bone. And for Marjorie, every time she looked at the plaque beneath the blooming tree, she remembered the weight of Eldon's hand, the power of Rufus's vigil, and the meaning of the last command. She carried it into her nursing, into her life, reminding herself and others that sometimes the greatest lessons do not come from textbooks or teachers, but from silent figures who endure, who love without condition, and who remind us of the strength hidden in loyalty. The end of Rufus's story was not in grief, but in the message he left behind that love does not end with death, that loyalty does not crumble in the face of loss, and that devotion, when pure, can outlast time itself. He had been a soldier's companion, a hospital's guardian, a community's symbol, and in the end, his final act was to show that love lingers long after the heart has stopped beating. Marjorie understood then that Eldon had not left Rufus alone, nor had Rufus left Eldon behind. They had fulfilled their promise to each other, and in doing so they had given everyone who witnessed their bond the gift of believing in something greater than themselves. The end. If this story moved, you don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss more stories like this. I'd love to hear what part of Rufus and Eldon's bond touched you the most. Was it the long vigil outside the hospital, the final reunion, or the way the community honored him afterward? Share your thoughts in the comments, and also tell me where you're watching from. Every story lives longer when people carry it with them, and your voice helps keep it alive.